The Venezuela moment that changed everything. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not because it was the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in Venezuela's presidential election, but because of what happened in the 72 hours that followed. On the surface, it was just another contested election in a country that has spent the last decade teetering between dictatorship and collapse. The official results gave Maduro 51% of the vote, his opposition 44%, and the rest scattered among minor candidates. The U.S. State Department called it a sham before the ballots were even counted. The EU demanded transparency. The OAS, as usual, denounced the process as fraudulent. And within days, the Biden administration was floating the idea of recognizing opposition leader Edmundo González as the legitimate president, setting the stage for a full-blown constitutional crisis. But here's the I've studied Latin American politics for 30 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this wasn't just another election dispute. This was the moment when the tectonic plates of global power shifted beneath our feet, and most people still don't realize it. I'm not talking about Venezuela itself, though God knows that country has been a geopolitical pressure cooker for years. No, I'm talking about what this moment revealed about the United States' eroding influence, the rise of a new axis of resistance, and the quiet but irreversible reordering of the Western Hemisphere. This was the first time in modern history that Washington's ability to dictate outcomes in its own backyard was openly defied, not by a rival superpower, but by a coalition of second-tier powers acting in concert. And if you think this is just about Venezuela, you're missing the bigger picture. Let me explain why this matters more than anything that's happened in the last decade. The official what they want you to believe. The story you've been told goes something like Venezuela is a failed state, a cautionary tale of socialism run amok, or a corrupt regime clings to power through fraud and repression while its people starve. The election was stolen again, and the United States, along with its democratic allies, has a moral obligation to support the opposition's claim to legitimacy. The Biden administration, we're told, is carefully calibrating its response, balancing pressure on Maduro with the need to avoid another chaotic regime change debacle like the one that backfired so spectacularly in 2019, when Juan Guaido's self-declaration as interim president led to nothing but embarrassment for Washington. The numbers seem to support this narrative. The opposition claims it has 80% of the physical vote tallies, showing González won by a landslide. The Carter Center, which had observers on the ground, called the election not democratic. The U.S. intelligence community, according to leaks to the New York Times, believes Maduro's victory was manufactured. And let's not forget the human rights arbitrary arrests, censorship, economic misery. By all accounts, this should have been a slam dunk for the opposition. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. First, the opposition's own data doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The 80% of tallies they claim to have? They're not from the official electoral system, they're from photos of receipts taken at polling stations, which can be manipulated or selectively released. The Carter Center's statement was unusually harsh, but it didn't actually say the election was stolen, it said the process was so flawed that it couldn't be considered free or fair. That's not the same thing as proving fraud. And the U.S. intelligence assessment? Well, let's just say that if the last 20 years have taught us anything, it's that intelligence agencies don't always get it right when it comes to regime change. Second, the opposition itself is deeply divided. González was a last-minute replacement for Maria Corina Machado, who was barred from running. Machado is a hardliner, beloved by Washington but toxic to many Venezuelans who remember her ties to the old elite and her support for the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. González, by contrast, is a career diplomat with no real political base. The fact that the opposition coalesced around him at all was a sign of desperation, not strength. And third, this is the part no one in the mainstream media is talking about, there's the little matter of what happened before the election. In the months leading up to July 28, there were back-channel negotiations between the Maduro government and the Biden administration. The U.S. had already eased some sanctions in exchange for promises of a freer electoral process. Maduro, for his part, had allowed opposition candidates to run, released some political prisoners, and even invited international observers. It wasn't a perfect election, but it was the most open Venezuela had seen in years. So why, then, did the U.S. pivot so hard against Maduro the moment the results came in? Why did they immediately recognize Gonzales as the winner, even before the opposition had presented its full case? And why, just days later, did the Treasury Department reimpose sanctions that had only recently been lifted? The answer has nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with geopolitics. What's really happening in Venezuela? Let me tell you what the data actually shows and what the establishment doesn't want you to know. First, the election wasn't stolen in the way the opposition claims. Yes, there were irregularities. Yes, the playing field was tilted. But the idea that Gonzales won by 20 points is almost certainly false. Independent polling before the election, including from firms like Dataanalysis, which has been critical of Maduro, showed a tight race, with Maduro holding a narrow but consistent lead. The opposition's own internal polls had Maduro ahead by 2 to 3 points in the final weeks. So where did this sudden landslide come from? Here's the most likely: the opposition's evidence is a mix of genuine polling station data and manufactured numbers designed to create the illusion of a stolen election. Some of the receipts they've released are real. Others are not. And crucially, they don't include the votes from the state-controlled electronic system, which is where any real fraud would have occurred. If Maduro did steal the election, he did it in a way that left no digital footprint, which, given Venezuela's history of electoral manipulation, is possible but far from proven. Second, the U.S. response wasn't about democracy, it was about leverage. The Biden administration had been negotiating with Maduro for months, trying to secure a deal that would stabilize Venezuela's oil exports, reduce migration flows, and most importantly, prevent Caracas from drifting further into the orbit of Russia, China, and Iran. Those talks were making progress. Too much progress, in fact, for some in Washington. And that brings us to the third, and most critical: this wasn't just about Venezuela. This was about sending a message to the rest of the global South. Let me be: the U.S. didn't pivot against Maduro because of the election. It pivoted because Maduro had just done something Washington couldn't tolerate: he had successfully played the great powers off against each other. In the weeks before the vote, Venezuela signed a series of high-profile deals with China, including a $5 billion investment in its oil sector. Russia announced it would extend military cooperation, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. And Iran, which has been quietly propping up Maduro's regime for years, sent a delegation to discuss deepening economic ties. This was the nightmare scenario for a Latin American country, right in its own backyard, openly aligning with its adversaries while the U.S. was distracted by wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. And Maduro, ever the survivor, had just pulled off the ultimate geopolitical jiu-jitsu. He had turned Venezuela into a battleground for great power competition, and in doing so, he had made himself indispensable. That's why the U.S. response was so swift and so aggressive. It wasn't about the election. It was about reasserting control. The exited geopolitical: the new Cold War comes to the Americas. Now, let's out. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader struggle for global dominance in the 21st century. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could maintain a unipolar world order, that it could dictate the rules of the game, punish those who defied it, and reshape entire regions in its image. That assumption is now collapsing. And Venezuela is the first major test of what comes in. Let's start with the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. China is the world's largest economy in purchasing power terms. Russia, despite its economic weaknesses, remains a nuclear-armed state with a veto at the UN Security Council. And the global South, from India to Brazil to South Africa, is increasingly asserting its independence, refusing to choose sides in the new Cold War. This is the context in which Venezuela's election took place. Maduro, like many leaders in the developing world, has adopted what I call the multi-vector foreign policy, a strategy of playing the great powers off against each other to maximize leverage. It's not ideological. It's survival. And it's working. Consider the China has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, securing long-term supply contracts that bypass U.S. sanctions. In return, Venezuela has become a key node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, with Chinese commies building ports, railways, and even a new satellite launch facility in the country. Russia has deepened its military ties with Caracas, including the deployment of nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. More recently, Russia has provided intelligence support, cybersecurity assistance, and even mercenaries from the Wagner Group to help prop up Maduro's regime. Iran has become Venezuela's lifeline, supplying refined gasoline, food, and even drones in exchange for gold and oil. The two countries have also collaborated on sanctions-busting schemes, including the use of Iranian tankers to smuggle Venezuelan oil to markets in Asia. This is what real multipolarity looks like. And it's a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. has two options when faced with this kind of it can either accept the new reality and adapt, or it can double down on coercion and risk a catastrophic miscalculation. Guess which one it's choosing? Military and strategic, the ghosts of regime change past. Let me be the people pushing for a hardline response to Venezuela have not learned the lessons of Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan. I've been warning about this for years. The U.S. foreign policy establishment is addicted to the idea that it can reshape the world through force, sanctions, and covert action. But every time it tries, the result is the chaos, unintended consequences, and a further erosion of American credibility. Venezuela is no different. The military options on the table are all terrible. A direct invasion is off the table. No one in Washington is stupid enough to repeat the Iraq fiasco in a country with a population of 28 million, a standing army of 120,000, and the backing of Russia and China. But that doesn't mean the hawks aren't pushing for other forms of intervention. Here's what's actually being discussed in the halls of 1. Covert action. The CIA has a long history in Venezuela, from the failed 2002 coup against Chavez to the botched 2019 humanitarian aid stunt that ended with Guaido's motorcade being pelted with rocks. The agency is almost certainly running operations to destabilize Maduro's regime, including support for opposition groups, cyber attacks on Venezuela's infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns. But here's the covert action rarely works when the target regime is as entrenched as Maduro's. And if it fails, it only strengthens the government's narrative that it's under siege by foreign powers. 2. Naval blockade. The U.S. has already imposed a de facto blockade on Venezuela's oil exports through sanctions. But some in the Pentagon are pushing for a more aggressive approach, a full naval interdiction to prevent Iranian and Russian ships from docking in Venezuelan ports. This is a dangerous game. A blockade is an act of war, and if the U.S. intercepts a Russian or Chinese vessel, it risks a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power. 3. No-fly zone. This is the nuclear option. A no-fly zone would require the U.S. to shoot down Venezuelan aircraft, which would almost certainly provoke a response from Russia or Iran. It would also require a massive military commitment, including the deployment of fighter jets, AWACS surveillance planes, and ground-based air defense systems. And for what? To protect an opposition that has no real plan for governing? For proxy war, the U.S. could arm and train Venezuelan opposition forces, turning the country into a battleground for a low-intensity conflict. This is what happened in Syria, where the U.S. backed rebel groups against Assad, only to see them co-opted by jihadists. In Venezuela, the risk is that any armed opposition would fracture along ideological lines, leading to a civil war that could destabilize the entire region. None of these options are good. All of them carry the risk of escalation. And yet, the hawks in Washington are pushing for them anyway, because they can't accept the idea that the U.S. might not get its way. Let me tell you something that no one in the Pentagon will admit: in the U.S. military is stretched thin. Between Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and now Venezuela, the U.S. is trying to project power in 4 different theaters at once. And it's not sustainable. Russia and China know this. That's why they're testing U.S. resolve in places like Venezuela. They're probing for weaknesses, looking for opportunities to extend their influence without triggering a direct confrontation. And so far, they're winning. The domestic political why Venezuela matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the U.S. domestic politics. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics, it's about votes. And not just any votes. It's about Florida. Florida is the ultimate swing state, and its Venezuelan American community is a key voting bloc. There are over 500,000 Venezuelans in Florida, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are fiercely opposed to any engagement with his government. For years, the Republican Party has owned this constituency, painting Democrats as soft on socialism and weak on Venezuela. Biden can't afford to lose Florida again. And that's why his administration has taken such a hard line on Maduro. But here's the Venezuelan American community isn't monolithic. Many of them don't support the opposition's more radical factions. Some even believe that engaging with Maduro while keeping pressure on him is the best way to secure democratic reforms. And yet, the Biden administration has chosen to side with the hardliners, because that's what plays best in Miami. This is a classic case of domestic politics distorting foreign policy. The U.S. is making decisions about Venezuela based on the electoral needs of one state, rather than the long-term strategic interests of the country. And it's not just Florida. The broader U.S. political landscape is deeply polarized, and Venezuela has become a wedge issue. Republicans are using it to attack Biden as weak on authoritarianism, while Democrats are trying to outflank them by taking an even harder line. The result is a feedback loop of escalation, where neither side can afford to back down. This is how foreign policy disasters happen. Not because of grand strategic miscalculations, but because of short-term political calculations. Scenario: what comes next in Venezuela? So where does this leave us? Let me lay out the three most likely scenarios and why none of them are good. Scenario 1: the soft coup. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies continue to recognize González as the legitimate president, while Maduro digs in and refuses to step down. The opposition, emboldened by international support, launches mass protests and civil disobedience campaigns. The military, which has so far remained loyal to Maduro, begins to fracture. Some units defect, while others crack down on protesters. The country descends into chaos, with competing centers of power vying for control. This is the most likely path to regime change, but it's also the most dangerous. A soft coup in Venezuela would almost certainly lead to a prolonged period of instability, with the risk of civil war. And even if Maduro falls, there's no guarantee that the opposition would be able to govern effectively. Remember, this is the same opposition that couldn't even agree on a single candidate until the last minute. Scenario 2: the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. Maduro remains in power, but the U.S. and its allies refuse to recognize his government. Sanctions are reimposed, and Venezuela is cut off from the global financial system. The country's economy, already in shambles, deteriorates further. Migration flows to the U.S. and neighboring countries increase. And Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a festering wound in the Western Hemisphere that no one can fix. This is the scenario that plays into Russia and China's hands. A frozen conflict in Venezuela gives them a permanent foothold in the Americas, a base from which to project power and undermine U.S. influence. It also creates a black market for Venezuelan oil, which Russia and Iran can exploit to evade sanctions. Scenario 3: the Great Power Showdown. This is the nightmare scenario. The U.S. imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela, and Russia or China responds by sending warships to escort their tankers. A confrontation ensues, and the U.S. is forced to back down or escalate. Meanwhile, Maduro declares a state of emergency and cracks down on the opposition, leading to a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets, and Russia retaliates by supplying advanced air defense systems to Caracas. This is how a regional crisis becomes a global one. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The U.S. and Russia have already come dangerously close to direct conflict in Syria. Venezuela could be in. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let me step back for a moment and ask a bigger why is the U.S. so obsessed with Venezuela? The answer, I believe, lies in the fundamental flaw of American grand strategy over the last three: the belief that the U.S. can impose its vision of liberal democracy on every corner of the globe without consequence. This was the hubris of the post-Cold War era, the unipolar moment when the U.S. believed it could reshape the world in its image through a combination of military force, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. Venezuela was never just about Venezuela, it was about the last gasp of a dying hegemonic order trying to reassert itself in its own backyard. Now, what most people don't realize is that this strategy was doomed from the start, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because of basic geopolitical arithmetic. The US spent the 2000s and 2010s overextending itself in the Middle East while China and Russia quietly built alternative power structures, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative. By the time Washington woke up to the fact that its unipolar moment was over, it was already too late. The world had moved on, and Venezuela became the perfect test case for whether the US could still enforce its will in its own hemisphere. Let me explain why this matters. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia was supposed to be the great strategic realignment, a recognition that China, not the Middle East, was the real long-term challenge. But then came the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, and the Syrian civil war, all of which pulled US attention back to the old battlegrounds. Meanwhile, China was making inroads in Latin America, signing energy deals with Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, while Russia reasserted itself in the region through arms sales and military cooperation. By the time Trump took office, the US was playing catch-up, and Venezuela became the proxy for a much larger struggle. Here's the uncomfortable: the US never had a coherent strategy for Venezuela because it never had a coherent strategy for Latin America in the 21st century. The Monroe Doctrine, that 19th-century relic, was dusted off and repurposed as a justification for regime change, but it was never updated for a world where China and Russia were active players in the region. The result was a series of half-measures, sanctions that hurt the Venezuelan people more than the regime, diplomatic recognition of a parallel government that had no real power, and covert operations that went nowhere. And then there's the military dimension, which is where things get really dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA, but those were Cold War operations with clear objectives. Today, the US military is stretched thin, and the public has no appetite for another foreign adventure. That's why the Trump administration's saber-rattling, "Remember when John Bolton was photographed with a notepad that read 5,000 troops to Colombia," never went anywhere. The Pentagon knows that a full-scale invasion of Venezuela would be a logistical nightmare, and the political fallout would be catastrophic. But that doesn't mean the military option is off the table. What's more likely is a low-intensity conflict, a kind of hybrid war where the US provides covert support to opposition groups, while Russia and China supply Maduro with the tools to survive. We've already seen this play out in Syria, where the US backed rebels while Russia propped up Assad. The difference is that Venezuela is right on America's doorstep, and the stakes are much higher. Let's talk about those stakes. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, and its collapse has sent shockwaves through global energy markets. The US has tried to isolate Venezuela economically, but Russia and China have stepped in to fill the void. Rosneft, the Russian state-owned oil company, has been a key player in Venezuela's oil sector, helping Maduro evade US sanctions by rerouting oil shipments through third countries. China, meanwhile, has extended billions in loans to Venezuela, secured by future oil deliveries. This isn't just about money, it's about control. If Russia and China can keep Venezuela afloat, they can keep the US from dominating the Western Hemisphere's energy resources. Then there's the military angle. Russia has already deployed military advisors to Venezuela, and in 2019, 2 Russian nuclear-capable bombers landed in Caracas as a show of force. The message was, if the US tries to remove Maduro, Russia will respond. China, for its part, has been more cautious, but it has sold Venezuela advanced radar systems and drones, and it has a growing military presence in the region through its base in Djibouti and its extant naval operations in the Pacific. Now, imagine a scenario where the US imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela to enforce sanctions. Russia or China could respond by sending warships to escort their tankers, just as they've done in the Persian Gulf. The US would then have to decide whether to back down or escalate. If it escalates, we're looking at a direct confrontation between the world's great powers in the Caribbean. And if it backs down, it sends a message that the US can no longer enforce its will in its own hemisphere. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The US and Russia have already come dangerously close to direct conflict in Syria, where Russian mercenaries were killed in a US airstrike in 2018. Venezuela is even more volatile because it's so close to home. A miscalculation, a stray missile, a down plane, any of these could spiral into a crisis that neither side wants but neither can control. And that's the real danger of the Venezuela moment. It's not just about one country's collapse, it's about the unraveling of the entire post-Cold War order. The US is no longer the sole superpower, and its attempts to reassert dominance are only accelerating the shift toward a multipolar world. Russia and China see Venezuela as an opportunity to challenge US hegemony, and they're willing to play the long game. The question is whether the US can adapt, or whether it will keep clinging to a strategy that no longer works. What we're witnessing in Venezuela is the death of liberal hegemony, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The US can no longer impose its will on the world through force or coercion, and its attempts to do so are only making things worse. The real question is what comes in. Will the US accept a world where it's just one power among many, or will it double down on a strategy that's already failed? The answer to that question will shape the 21st century. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about geopolitics, it's a story about domestic politics, too. And in Venezuela, the two are inseparable. The Maduro regime's survival isn't just about Russian mercenaries or Chinese loans, it's about the way the government has systematically dismantled the last remnants of democratic accountability while maintaining just enough control to avoid total collapse. This isn't some abstract dictatorship. It's a finely tuned machine of repression, co-optation, and economic sabotage, and understanding how it works is key to predicting what comes in. Let me explain why this matters. Most Western analysts look at Venezuela and see a failed state, a cautionary tale about socialism, or a pawn in great power competition. But what they miss is that Maduro's government is far more resilient than it appears. It's not just propped up by foreign backers, it's sustained by a domestic political economy that rewards loyalty, punishes dissent, and ensures that even the regime's enemies have a stake in its survival. This isn't North Korea. Venezuela still has elections, opposition parties, and a semblance of pluralism. But those institutions are hollowed out, weaponized to legitimize the regime while giving the illusion of choice. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's strategy isn't just about staying in power, it's about making sure that no one else can take power, even if he wanted to step aside. The regime has spent the last decade systematically dismantling the institutions that could challenge it. The National Assembly? Stacked with loyalists after the 2020 parliamentary elections, which the opposition boycotted and the US refused to recognize. The judiciary? Packed with judges who rubber stamp every executive decree. The military? Co-opted through corruption, with generals given control over lucrative smuggling routes, gold mines, and food distribution networks. Even the opposition is fragmented, with some factions willing to negotiate with the regime in exchange for crumbs, while others demand total surrender. Now, you might if the regime is so unpopular, why hasn't it collapsed? The answer lies in what I call the Venezuela paradox, a system where the government is weak enough to be despised but strong enough to survive. The economy is in ruins, but the regime controls the few remaining sources of wealth. Hyperinflation has destroyed the bolivar, but the government has dollarized parts of the economy, creating a parallel system where elites and loyalists can still thrive. The black market is the real economy now, and the regime's cronies are its gatekeepers. This isn't just corruption, it's a survival strategy. By making sure that the people who matter most, generals, businessmen, local strongmen, have a financial stake in the system, Maduro has turned Venezuela into a kleptocracy with a revolutionary facade. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The regime isn't just surviving, it's evolving. In the early years, Chavismo relied on mass mobilization, oil money, and charismatic leadership. Today, it's a leaner, meaner machine, one that has learned to govern through coercion and selective repression rather than consent. The 2017 protests, which saw millions take to the streets, were crushed with brutal efficiency. The 2018 presidential election, which Maduro won amid widespread allegations of fraud, was a turning point. The opposition's attempt to declare Juan Guaidó interim president in 2019 was a desperate gamble, and it failed because the regime had already neutralized the institutions that could have made it work. The US and its allies recognized Guaidó, but without control over the military, the courts, or the bureaucracy, his presidency was doomed from the start. So what does this mean for the future? The most likely scenario is what I called zombie stability, a country that is neither fully collapsed nor fully functional, where the regime limps along, avoiding total disaster but unable to fix anything. The economy will remain a patchwork of dollarization, smuggling, and subsistence, with the vast majority of Venezuelans trapped in poverty while a small elite profits from the chaos. The opposition will remain divided, with some factions willing to negotiate with the regime for minor concessions, while others refuse to play ball. The military will continue to be the real power behind the throne, ensuring that any transition, if it happens, is on their terms. But there are other scenarios, too, and they're not as far-fetched as they seem. The first is a slow-motion implosion, where the regime's grip weakens just enough to trigger a power struggle within the ruling elite. This could happen if oil production collapses further, if Russia or China reduce their support, or if a key faction in the military decides Maduro is more of a liability than an asset. The problem is that Venezuela's institutions are so degraded that any transition would likely be messy, violent, and unpredictable. We've seen this before, in Libya after Gaddafi, in Yemen after Saleh, where the collapse of a regime doesn't lead to democracy but to warlordism and fragmentation. The second scenario is even more a sudden, violent rupture. This could be triggered by a U.S. military intervention, a coup attempt, or a popular uprising that the regime can't contain. The risk here is that Venezuela's security forces are not a monolith. The National Guard, the intelligence services, and the colectivos, pro-government paramilitary groups, all have different agendas. If the regime starts to crack, these factions could turn on each other, leading to a civil conflict that spills over into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. And let's not forget the millions of Venezuelan refugees who have already fled the country. A full-blown civil war would send another wave of migrants north, putting even more pressure on an already strained U.S. immigration system. The third scenario is the one no one wants to talk: the regime survives, but Venezuela becomes a narco-state. This isn't just speculation. The U.S. has already indicted Nicolas Maduro and several of his top officials on drug trafficking charges. The DEA estimates that Venezuelan officials facilitate the shipment of 250 tons of cocaine to the US and Europe every year. The Cartel of the Suns, a network of military officers and government officials, has turned Venezuela into a hub for drug trafficking, with the regime taking a cut of the profits. If this trend continues, Venezuela could become a permanent criminal enclave, a black hole in the Western Hemisphere where the rule of law no longer applies. Now, here's the part that should keep policymakers up at night. None of these scenarios are mutually exclusive, and all of them have one thing in their bad for the U.S. A Venezuela in perpetual crisis is a Venezuela that exports instability through migration, through crime, through great power competition. And yet, the U.S. has no coherent strategy for dealing with it. Sanctions have failed to dislodge Maduro, but they've also failed to alleviate the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans. The Biden administration has taken a slightly more pragmatic approach than Trump, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions, but it's too little, too late. The regime has already rigged the game, and no amount of U.S. pressure is going to change that. The real question is whether the U.S. can accept that it no longer has the leverage it once did. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that it could shape outcomes in Latin America through a mix of coercion and incentives. But Venezuela has exposed the limits of that approach. The U.S. can't impose democracy from the outside, and it can't force a transition through sanctions alone. The only way forward is to recognize that the old playbook is broken and that a new one is needed, one that acknowledges the reality of a multipolar world and the resilience of authoritarian regimes. But here's the U.S. political system isn't built for nuance. Venezuela has become a domestic political football, with Republicans accusing Democrats of being soft on socialism and Democrats accusing Republicans of wanting to start another war. Neither side is interested in a serious debate about what actually works. The result is a policy that lurches between extremes: maximum pressure one day, half-hearted negotiations the next, with no clear endgame. So where does that leave us? In the short term, we're likely to see more of the regime that survives through repression and foreign support, an opposition that remains divided, and a U.S. that keeps throwing sanctions at the problem without a plan for what comes in the long term. The most likely outcome is that Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a country that is too big to fail but too broken to fix. And that's the real tragedy of the Venezuela moment. It's not just that the US has lost influence in its own backyard, it's that the tools it once used to project power are no longer effective, and no one has figured out what to replace them with. The lesson here isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the limits of American power in the 21st century. The US can no longer assume that it can shape the world in its image, and the sooner it accepts that, the better. But acceptance requires humility, and humility is in short supply in Washington. So instead of adapting, the US will keep doubling down on strategies that don't work, hoping that this time, somehow, they'll get a different result. And that, more than anything else, is why the Venezuela moment changed everything. It didn't just expose the fragility of US hegemony, it showed that the system itself is broken, and no one knows how to fix it.